Good morning, everybody. It is splendid to see you here on this bright, sunshiny day, and yesterday as well. We've had a real gift of grace when it comes to God's presence in creation. It seems good when the sun is shining and the air is warm. We like to light this candle, and we like to say a few words about it, and I'm sure any one of you, what would you say if you were lighting this candle? Just say a couple of things. What would you say? What's that candle about? Caroline, yes?
It symbolizes that God is with us.
It symbolizes that God is with us. It's a little picture to give us a sense of something that we can't see with our eyes. Any other ideas? Different ways of saying the same thing? What I was thinking this morning is that the sun is way up there, and I realize if my grade 7 science serves me well, that it's about 93 million, sorry for this old phrase, miles from here. I don't know how many kilometers it is. Does anybody know how many kilometers the sun is? 93 times something. But the sun is 93 million miles away, and yet we go like this, and it says, "Oh, I love you," and we say, "Oh, you feel so good." And in the same way that the sun is made out of electrons and protons, this little light is made of electrons and protons, and we're made of electrons and protons. It's as if there's only one life in the whole universe. And though we know that that life is divided in many ways, today we want to celebrate the hope of unity, the possibility that the human race can get together with creation and the whole thing can shine just the way God had hoped it would in the beginning. Jay says the stories are at the beginning and at the end, the Alpha and the Omega. And I chose those texts for exactly that reason. And as you know, that between those two texts, there are thousands and thousands of other texts. Between those two stories, there are many, many stories that are told in our tradition. I would like to say a little bit about a concept called two-eyed seeing, which is shared by most indigenous people. And if you've ever seen Native American art, you will often see something like a picture of a polar bear over here as a polar bear. And then over here you'll see another picture which is basically the shape of a polar bear, but it's got all kinds of colors and it's got all kinds of geometric patterns. And the indigenous people knew that we lived in two realities. The one reality is the natural world, the things we sang about in our opening songs, the goodness of creation. We live in a place of rivers. The text speaks of the 4 rivers. The indigenous people speak of the 4 directions. We're always looking for common ground between our stories and the stories of other people. We could look for difference if we wanted to. We could say, no, your story is wrong, our story is right. But Grandma, in the little story we told the kids, knew that although it was worthwhile hearing Cree stories, it was also good to hear Ojibwe stories because it helped you get a fuller perspective on your experience in the world. We are natural creatures. No matter what, I would affirm for you that the 2 most precious things that we can take hold of are water and air. There was a Catholic mystic by the name of Fenelon. And Fenelon wondered why it was that the human beings worked with such energy to dig into the earth, to go to obscure places, to find what they called treasures, gold and silver and jewels. And Fenelon suggested that the real treasure was in a drop of dew on a leaf in the morning catching the sunlight. Fenelon suggested that that drop of dew on that leaf in the sunlight was as precious, perhaps more precious, than any kind of jewelry we might obtain for ourselves. There is the physical world, which is our body. And it is truly our body. There's one water that makes up all of us. There's one air that animates all of us. And the sad thing is that we have become divided over things that don't really matter at all. Now, being one body on the planet gives us a start point for exploring how we might go into the future confidently. That is to say, at the most basic level, we belong to one another. All of the people of the planet. Now, that's the one world, the biological world, the physical world. But if you go to any of these people, and those of you who have been to far places and have had experiences with the culture, know that everywhere, generally when food is being shared, stories are being told. So I would like to make the case that we live in the physical world which we all share together, but we also live in a story world. So it becomes very important as to what kind of story world do we live in. Now, I was thinking about this week, and I realized that when I was a younger man, the story of our society was more unified. We basically shared a lot of ideas when we were younger. But over the space of my lifetime, that original story, the story that our grandparents brought from their homes in different places of the globe, that story got eroded and began to lose its ability to inspire and encourage us. And it was eroded by other stories. Now, the Bible has 4 basic stories that I'd like to recall. And these are the stories that I will suggest have been eroded by the stories that we are being told from other sources. The first story in the Bible is the story about God as creator. And that is shared by almost all indigenous people. They may not use the word God. They may not use the word creator. If we listen to them, we might not understand the words that they use. But if we took time to listen, we would notice that they all have this sense of a creator. And the basic idea in our tradition, the tradition of the Bible, is that the creation story lets us know that the natural world is just as it should be. There's nothing wrong with it. Even if it does give us joy as well as sorrow. Even if it does give us health as well as sickness. Even if it does give health as well as sickness, wealth as well as poverty. And I chose those deliberately because they reflect the marriage vows many of us made, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. We will remain true. And so we, as persons following in the way of the gospel, have determined that we will remain true to God in joy as well as in sorrow, in pain as well as in health, in poverty as well as in riches. We do not want to divide the world up and say that health is good and sickness is evil. Now we know that sickness presents us with challenges. We know that poverty presents us with challenges. We know that all kinds of things. But those challenges give us opportunity to exert our spiritual lives to overcome them and make manifest the goodness of God which transcends circumstance. Now all of this is language. And each of you, with your imagination, gets to participate in that language and to have some idea of what it might mean to you. Now, a child by the age of 12, and again I'm going to draw on my experience with Cree people up in Thompson, Manitoba. At the age of 12, the Cree people call the kids contraires. That is to say, at the age of 12, and we know this in our culture as well, and I guess most cultures, at the age of 12, the age of puberty, kids began to ask hard questions. Okay, if God is good and all creation is good, why is there so much bad? And that's the second story. The second story that is alluded to in what Jay read about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that we should not touch. In other words, the second story says, there's evil in the world, Because people have gotten hungry for power, and they've forgotten their unity in creation. They've forgotten their unity in the sight of God, and they've begun to work at making the kind of world that they want. And in the Bible, that almost always means the rise from the land into a city to a great height, and then a collapse again. So we have a story of the goodness of creation. We have a story that there's something wrong in creation. And then we have stories about how it is that God helps us come to terms with what's wrong by sending us teachers, by sending us leaders, by sending us guides and persons with insight. And this is the story of the prophets and the story of Jesus. God sees us in creation. We seem to be lost and going in all kinds of directions that are hurtful to ourselves and to the place where we live. And God wants to change that. And that's sort of where we come in as persons who listen to these stories. Because hearing this story about good creation, gone wrong, God seeking to heal it, our response should be, how can I get involved in the healing of creation? And I want to assure you that it begins not by focusing outwards about what you can change in the world of circumstance. The way to turn is inwards. To get back in touch with the reality of God that dwells within you. And to ask, dear God, how do you want to express your spirit in my life? And that's a question that you ought to be wrestling with all of the time. I've been wrestling with it since I was a child. And maybe that's why I have the confidence to freely use language to share with you the possibility of hope and encouragement. We have opportunity to get in touch with the goodness of creation. We have opportunity to resist the inclination to power. And we almost always choose power as a means to overcome our sense of insecurity. Power is a response to anxiety, but the dilemma is it grows to proportions that become harmful. So the fourth basic kind of stories that we find in our tradition are stories about the new creation, the new heaven and the new earth. So the goodness of God, it's gone wrong through human decision. God sends healers and teachers. We change our minds and we begin to move into that new possibility. And I want to stress that this story is important because sometimes we get nostalgic and we think, if only we could go back to the way it was. I'm afraid time moves only in one direction, forward. We cannot go back. But what we can do is, in the smallest details of our lives, is try to distinguish between what helps me as a human being and what harms me as a human being. What helps us as human being and what harms us. And the question following is, what helps creation and what harms creation? And in a very basic way, daily, choosing what helps and rejecting what hinders. Now, we are storytelling people. Those four categories of stories in the Bible help us to form a philosophy or an idea of life that makes it possible to go forward confidently, hopefully, and courageously. Now, there is no one on the planet more in need of these spiritual elements than the youngest generation on the whole planet. Barbara heard a small observation in the media, or I think, where did you hear it, Barbara? About the anxiety in children.
Oh, Andrea shared.
And Andrea and Barbara were talking, and there's research being shown that children at a very early age are coming to school highly anxious. And I thought about that a little bit this week, and I realized that, as I said earlier, when I was a boy, the story was pretty unified. But right now, if you go out into the streets, if you go into public places, if you watch television or listen to the radio or read the newspaper, it's hard to tell what the story is. It's as if there are 10,000 stories all competing. And what I'm going to suggest is that what we do at this point in our human history is turn away from our idea of progress and say, if we're going to go towards the future, what can we learn from indigenous people of every continent? Because on every continent, human beings have lived for thousands of generations. They've had children, they've had joy and they've had sorrow, they've had sickness and they've had health, they've had all the good and all the hard. But they've survived through all the generations, and the key component to their survival was the stories that they told to their children. And you as seniors, you as mature persons, you as young adults, have access to children's lives. And I hope that you will tell stories confidently, stories that inspire in children hope, things that inspire in children courage and creativity. In other words, that the focus of your living will not be on your immediate present, but on the future of these children. Now, this is hard work in a certain sense, although it's very enjoyable. Many people, when I suggest this, have said, I don't know how to tell stories. I don't remember all the elements of a story. And Mr. Thomas King, who I mentioned earlier, is very helpful to me. And he said, you don't need to know the details of the story. You just need to know the general outline. And if you tell the story to the best of your ability, the child will hear it. And the message the child will get may not be the information that the story conveys. The message the child will get is the love that's in your heart for the child. So the story is simply a means for love to be communicated from your heart to the heart of the child. And of course, if it works for a child, it'll work for an adolescent. It's a little bit more challenging. It'll work for a grown-up. Sometimes the hardest place to try to get folks to change their imaginations when they're set in their ways. But the love that's in your heart should inform every sentence you speak. Every time you say good morning to your neighbor, there should be love in your heart. Because words can give us reasons to fight. And how many here who have experienced marriage of some years don't know what I'm talking about? But words ought not to divide us. Words ought to unite us. And so we now have opportunity to think, what's the story I'd like to tell people I meet about my relationship with the Creator and about my relationship with creation? You see, we were born to be storytellers. And there's a modern saying, information is power. I will suggest to you that information is confusing. But stories offer us the power for change, the power for newness. We just have to be determined to tell stories that inspire and encourage. So I thank you for listening, and I encourage you to tell stories. And one of the ways we tell stories is by singing songs. And this is a song about what is possible for the human race. I see a new heaven.